I knew you were going to pray your college.
Couple things of old business. That's what I'm going to call this. Because one of the things we talked about last week that my mind went blank on was about the moving of the tabernacle. What happens and how does that? Because we hear so much about the tabernacle being so wholly structured, and especially the ark that only certain people could even touch it. And so what we find out is, well, let me go back up one. This is a timeline of major events in the wilderness, so that we have some concept about the timeline that's drawn through. You get the manna and the Ten Commandments and the water from the rock. You get all that kind of stuff jumbled up. And of course, it starts with that burning bush event with Moses and all the plagues and things. Then you have the crossing of the sea. There was quail and manna. That's when they finally had some food. They arrive at Sinai, and Moses meets God on the mountain and gives the Ten Commandments, also called the Ten Words or utterances. Then you can scoot down to where it says Moses was called to the mountain the second time, and that's when they uh, created the golden calf because of what they worshipped in Egypt, the construction of the tabernacle and the ordination of priests. You have the spy event, but then you have down at the bottom it says Moses Deuteronomy address. In case you're not familiar with the book of Deuteronomy, the whole thing, the duo there means second telling. And the book of Deuteronomy is thought to have been a direct uh, dictation of Moses as to what happened in the with him and God in the wilderness experience. And so you have all of that uh, creating, and then finally the death. And of course, we know he didn't get to go in because God said, "Speak to a rock and make water come out." He got mad, hit it with a stick. That doesn't seem fair. I think that's a little on the short side. He's done all this stuff. He's pleaded for all these people, and he hits it with a stick, and you don't let him in. But he does get to see over into it. And then here's about the moving of the tabernacle. Only the tribe of Levi uh, is the one who handles this. This comes in a section where they're doing a census of people, and that's what Numbers is. It's the spreadsheet of the Old Testament, giving you counts and counts of things. Uh, Rather, you shall appoint Levites over the tabernacle of the covenant, over all its equipment, over all its belongings, and they are to carry the tabernacle and all of its equipment, and they shall tend to it. Uh, we think when we hear about the wilderness experience that they roved for a while, they sat up tents, stayed a day or two, then moved and moved. It wasn't exactly like that. You had large spanses of time when they would be at one place before they packed up and moved again. And so that just kind of catches us up. Uh, so we've got the tabernacle now set up at Shiloh. And one of the first things that we experiences that we remember about that is the story of Samuel. If you remember that, it's a beautiful story. Hannah, who is a wife of a man who has two wives, the other wife is having children and she is not. She comes to the door of the tabernacle to ask God to remove her stain, which is being childless. And apparently, she goes over and leans against the building and is praying silently, so to speak. Eli, the high priest, sees her and sees her mouth moving, and he suspects she's drunk. And so he comes over and scolds her. And when he does, she then just pours her heart out about how she feels like God has abandoned her because she hasn't had a child. Well, he blesses her, and sure enough, she has a son. and she promised God if the child was going to be a boy, when he got big enough, he would be turned over to the priest and raised as a priest in the temple, tabernacle. And of course, she does, and she brings the boy, and basically Eli raises Samuel. And of course, we hear the story about Samuel having being awakened at night with that voice. Samuel, yes, I'm here. And he runs to Eli. He does that, and finally Eli realizes that's the voice of God. He says, next time you just answer and said, here I am. And that's when this young boy receives a very powerful vision about the future of the Israelite people. Uh, but while it was there, you have the tabernacle at Shiloh, which is the main place where people are moving to at least once a year, if at all possible, to do sacrifice and to have a worship experience. But because now they are in the land and they're beginning to capture and have a home base for every tribe, they scatter some altars around with some priests so that you don't have to travel everywhere. And if you have a blessing you want to share, if you felt like you've harmed somebody and you need to ask forgiveness, there's one within a reasonable distance that you can go and offer a sacrifice and have that. Because for them, sacrifice equaled worship. That was the worship event. And it stayed there at Shiloh. And then finally, after the kingdom was organized, you had King Saul, who was the one who really organized 12 individual tribes into a singular nation. Uh, and he was a king for a while. And then suddenly David comes behind that. David not only brings more order to it, he even expands the footprint of the kingdom to the largest it will ever be and decides that now he has established a capital city, which is a very special place. It's the place where Abraham met Melchizedek, uh, the king of Salem and priest of the Most High God. It's also there that it is said that Abraham takes Isaac for the sacrifice. It said that's where Jacob had the dream about the gateway to heaven. All of that puts it at this community called Salem, but now has been renamed as the capital, Jerusalem. And David decides to bring it in. And, that's, he tries to bring it once and takes 30,000 men with him up to Shiloh. They're going to bring this thing in. It's carried on a cart. And if you remember, the cart hit a bump. Uzziah reaches out to keep it from falling and is struck dead. David gets mad at God about that and says, take it back. We'll figure this out. Finally, David gets his heart right, goes one more time back to bring it back. And it worked a little smoother. Uh, and he brings it back to Jerusalem. And of course, the scene, this is a G rated image here because you remember that when he brings the ark into Jerusalem, he takes off his robe and he basically dances naked in the street in front as a leader of the parade. And there's a lot of criticism that goes around with that. Um, the question then came, what's inside the box now? Is it just like it was when it left uh, the wilderness? Um, is Aaron's rod still there? Is there still a jar of manna there? Are the tablets of Moses there? Um, there was a time just before this that the Philistines, which were over to, I guess, the west, stole the ark, and we're never told whether or not they opened the box and they have an Indiana Jones sort of an event, spirits flying at it. But we do know that while they had it, God, not being pleased, struck them with the plague. Now, when you read the Hebrew text and begin to go underneath it, the plague that they were covered with was a severe case of hemorrhoids, which doesn't sound pleasant. And they got so ill at this, they just said, we got to take this thing back. And so they took it back and gave it to the Israelites. And then David brings it in. And Chronicles tells us that now, as it's moving in, the only thing inside the box are the two tablets. So you've lost elements on the inside. Um, David, once he gets it there, he puts it in a tent. He wants to build a temple. The prophet Nathan, if you'll remember, tells him he's not going to do it. He's a man of war. So somebody else has got to do it. When David nears death, the kingship is assigned to Solomon, who seems to be a more peaceful person. He is the second child of Bathsheba, who he looked over and saw bathing on the roof. The first child that was conceived by that died. This is the second son. And he passed it on. There was a lot of riff about that because other sons felt like they were in charge of that. But Solomon was given the permission to build it and the footprint and construction of what's going on. And in order to build this temple in Jerusalem, it is going to take a massive workforce. He ordered 30,000 people from all over Israel to go and cut logs uh, up in Lebanon. Divided that into three groups of 10,000 each. 10,000 would go and cut for a month. They would come back home. A second 10,000 would go. They would come back home. So you'd have this triangle of a swap out. They were just doing the long part of it. He had 80,000 workers that were stone cutters for all the things around, um, and 3,000, uh, no, then 70,000 just to carry the stone. So you had all these cutting it, then you had those who would carry it, and then there were 3,000 on top of that who were the ones to oversee the work. This thing has a workforce of 183,000 people. That is huge. And I'd like to say it was all volunteer, but it was not. You were told to work. So it was really the first temple was built by forced labor. And here's basically the floor plan. And what Solomon's temple did was basically double the size of everything that happened in the tabernacle. There is a courtyard that surrounds the place, which is about the size of a football field. After it took 7 years to construct it, uh, you find out that it's 300 feet long, about 100 feet wide. The space is complex. You have uh, one altar. You have that what it was called the molten sea, which was the laver earlier, but you also had 10 other smaller ones that you could move around to cleanse from sacrifices to make themselves clean. And each of those, the molten sea, the larger one, held around 10,000 gallons of water. Um, the structure itself was not what we would think as spires and steeples. It looked just more like a square box, uh, 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet tall, uh, that comprised of the space outside, and then the building that was the temple itself had two major rooms, the holy place and then the Holy of Holies. And around that were storerooms where they would put their what they had received and the wealth that they had. And David had mentioned uh, the first week about the height of things. And this is where the height of things comes into play. Uh, in the tabernacle, everything's ground level. But now that you build the temple, things begin to get elevated. When you come in from the surrounding country, you have a step up that leads you to the major courtyard. And then as you approach the temple itself, there is a set of steps which takes you into the porch area. There's a set of steps that takes you into the holy place, and another set of steps that takes you into the Holy of Holies. So now what's happening, the further you go into the temple, the higher you are. The whole concept of the higher you are, the closer you are to God. And so that's how they moved that. Um, one of the things that and I think they did this actually in the tabernacle, but they did it definitely here, is right outside that door, there are two large pillars that stand side by side to the entrance. These are what we would term an Ebenezer, we had talked about earlier, and they named the columns. The first column's name is Boaz. I used to have fun with that when I taught at Sneed because Sneed was in Boaz, and so I could claim something there. And Boaz meant he is strong. The other column was named Jocham. He makes secure, so that Israel would be strong and secure under God's symbol itself there. And so as you move through that place, and you can see here again, after it's constructed, everything is covered. All the walls and ceilings are covered with gold. Now the floors are covered in gold. So, and then you also have much more ornate uh, appointments. You have the holy place that's there. There are 10 lamps inside the holy place instead of just one, 10 menorahs. There are 10 tables of showbread instead of just one. Uh, the inner surfaces are covered with gold and decorated with images of palm trees, flowers, and winged cherubim. Uh, the great hall, which is 30 feet wide and 30 feet long and 30 feet high, uh, that's where these objects were. Uh, inside the Holy of Holies, uh, you now have more ornates. You have two creatures that were on each side that were cherubim, uh, having heads of a human, the body of a lion, and the wings of the eagle that spanned all the way across the room. Each of them the wings met in the middle, and under that sat the ark. So it was under the protection of that. And then, of course, the ark was sitting on top of the foundation stone, what we now know as the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. Uh, and just as the tabernacle, with all this ornateness and the exquisite things going on here, the common person never gets to see it. They can hear stories about it, but they never get to see the the holy place, the glory of it all. Um, so the people moved toward that. Uh, Worship continued to be primarily sacrificial, although now you're beginning to add elements to the worship concept. They start chanting and having prayers, uh, which allowed a person to join in and kind of connect to that sacrificial event. As the priest did sacrifices, other priests would gather around and sing and offer blessings and prayer. Eventually, they even added musical instruments to the event. Uh, After the death of Solomon, the kingdom divided. It says that his son Rehoboam rose up in great arrogance thinking he was hot stuff. And what eventually happens, you have the nation split. The nation of Israel is comprised of the 10 northernmost tribes uh, of the Jewish community. The lower section is comprised of two, Judah and Benjamin. I like that because who knows what's the special thing about the tribe of Benjamin? They're all left-handed. That's the left-handed tribe. That's why I go for it. Now I have my left-handed tribe too. Uh, I have two daughters who married two men who are left-handed. I have a grandson who's left-handed. So I have my tribe of Benjamin going here. It's working well so far. The northern tribe felt isolated because they did not have access to the temple. They felt slighted. They even at one time created their own temple. The problem was that they did not worship Yahweh the way they had it before. They created for themselves golden idols of bulls and calves and told the people, you need to remember that these are the gods that brought you out of Egypt, just like the golden calf in the wilderness. They started worshiping the god Baal. In fact, that was one of the readings about 2 weeks ago in church, the cry against that wrongful worship. Um, so you have the northern kingdom in all of its disarray. They are confronted by the Assyrians, and in 721 they are overtaken. And what happens in this culture, when you take over a country like this, two things happen. One is they go in and they take out blocks of people, the strongest, the smartest, the best looking. They cart them off and put them in their culture, and we want to assimilate them into their Assyrian culture. And then they take Assyrian people and flood that northern part to intermarry with who's left. And so, in essence, in a generation, it disappears because there's no pure. In fact, that connection between the Assyrians and Israel are what is eventually termed as Sumerian people, that we know is in the middle that Jews would bypass because they considered them dirty people. So you had that happen. So by 721, that kingdom disappears. Um, one of the things, well, and then the southern kingdom uh, comes under the thumbnail of Nebuchadnezzar. He goes to Egypt, tries to conquer Egypt. It doesn't work, so he decides he'll take Israel instead. Uh, we think or have this feeling that he comes in and he just wraps his arm around all the people and just takes them off, but it goes in waves. He takes the smart ones, he takes the wealthy ones, he takes the bright ones, and the strong ones. And there's several waves that go down and are taken to Babylon. There are those that are left behind, the poor and the not so lovely, who by default now get to move into the houses of all the rich and the wealthy and the good looking, which creates a problem about 50 years later. Um, so they take them down there, and as they take this group of people down to Babylon, serious theological process starts taking place. Because even the Israelite people felt like God was territorial. Yahweh God did not exist outside the boundaries of Israel. So now that we are carted off and God is up there, what happens when we die? Do we not have the ability to connect with the God that we grew up with? How is that going to affect us? And then the other startling event was if we are so disconnected from our homeland and we're down here and suddenly we begin to get deluded, will we forget all the stories of who we were Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and we just disappear. And this really drove a stake into their heart about what are we going to do here? How are we going to preserve ourselves? Uh, so they were able to return. Darius the Mede comes in and takes over, and he allows them to return. Uh, and three things happen uh, when they return. Now, Nebuchadnezzar completely destroyed the temple. He burned it completely down. He robbed all of its riches and took it away. And so when these people go back, it's just all rubble. Uh, the first thing that happens, Nehemiah is going to rebuild a temple. It is not Solomon's temple at all. It's a much more simple structure. It's more about the size of the tabernacle. Uh, it doesn't, to start off with, it doesn't have a walled courtyard because they were building the wall of the city. But at least they were able to restart the sacrificial process again and bring back the priest and get them back into their duties. The second thing that happened to these people is that they said, now that we're back together in our homeland, we've got to sit down and write our story down so that it's just not memory. There is a place we can go to and say, here is our story. And so that's where the majority of the Old Testament finally gets pinned down and collected. Uh, the book of Genesis doesn't get written down until about 900. The stories of Daniel aren't written down until maybe 400 or 300. So you've got all these things. So the next thing is we need a written record of who we are. And then finally, the third thing is we've got to be able to get together as a community and tell each other these things. And so what you have is a new temple being built in its modest statue. The ark is gone. We don't know if it's in Ethiopia. We don't know what happened to it, if it's buried somewhere deep underground. We just know it's gone. So when Nehemiah makes his holy of holy place, the only thing behind the curtain is the top of the rock, that foundation stone. That's it. Uh, and then they create a worship process by which each community had a place to gather, and that is termed a synagogue. Uh, it is usually a U-shaped arena. People would sit there. They would have their readings and other things. The priest would do recitations every morning. Uh, the temple was still the place to have sacrifice, but the synagogue was the place where you learned about who you were and what happened throughout history. Um, at times, it became more of the town hall where people gathered, not just for religious purposes, but for taking care of business. The synagogue's name, Viet Khalifa, means house of prayer. And that's what it was supposed to be, where people could pray and study and gather together. Uh, and as they did that, they began to create a pattern, a liturgy, an order of worship. Which brings me to another thing. One of the things you do when you go into synagogue, if you are a male, is that you bring with you your tallit, your Jewish prayer shawl. Uh, the Jewish prayer shawl has to, if you're your everyday wear, it has blue tassels on each corner. Well, I think we talked about blue being God's color. It would have blue tassels because of that being that. The tallit, it actually means little tent, so that you would be covered up. Uh, This was given to me by a really marvelous friend who went to great lengths with a Jewish friend to acquire this and then gave it to me. And then, of course, you have to cover your head. Now, I can wear this legitimately because I wrote my friend, this Orthodox rabbi in Oxford, when I was teaching world religion. And in my world religion class, I would always dress like the culture as I was starting. I dressed in a Hindu garb and a Buddhist garb and a Jewish garb. And I asked Rabbi Solomon, I said, would it be offensive to the Jewish community if I wore a yarmulke? And so he sends me this note back. He said, Prince William wears a yarmulke when he goes to the Jewish community over here, and we have no problem with that at all. So I think it would be okay if you wanted to wear one over there in the colonies. Well, okay. But there are times of prayer, and this tallit becomes just that. It becomes a little tent. This is your sanctuary. This is your temple. This is your holy place, and how it works. You now they start off with a litany of open prayers, of songs and celebration. Uh, Many times the celebrant would begin the service by saying a prayer that says, "In peace, let us pray to the Lord." And they would lift up a prayer, and when he would stop, all the people would say, "Lord, have mercy." Have we heard that before? Don't we pray like that here every now and then? Lord, help all those in need. And in the congregation, as a group of people together, we respond, Lord, have mercy. So, see, that takes you all the way back that far. There was a time of confession when the people could confess to God what they have not done well. There's an intercessory prayer. Uh, there is a scripture reading, which usually was one from the law, one of the books of Moses, maybe the prophets, maybe the Psalms. And then there is a text of the day. Culturally, we have gotten away from what we used to call lectionary preaching. Us old ministers had a process that we preached from called the lectionary, which you had Matthew, Mark, and Luke in 3-year cycles, and John was scattered in. And and they basically had a lectionary cycle that they would read from. If you'll remember, when Jesus went to the synagogue that time, and they said, "Oh man, he's back home. We're going to let him do the reading of the day." And it says, and he unrolled the scroll to the text of that day. Of course, it didn't say he read it. He said, and then he said, I think he knew it. Uh, so you had that reading, and then from that reading, someone, for lack of a better term, preached a sermon on it. How this reading, how this text, how this story applies to our everyday life, and how we can live that out in God's grace.
Was the reading of the day the Shema, or was that the prayer? The Shema.
The Shema is a short prayer that they say every day.
Okay.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. They say that 5 times a day.
Because that's what we used to sing when I sang at a temple when I was in college.
Yeah.
And that just kind of stuck in there, and I didn't remember if that was the prayer or if that was
Yeah, it's a prayer. Well, it's a statement of who they are as Jewish people, but it's also a prayer that they would say during the day. It would constantly remind them of who they were. The benediction, also called the good word. We've been here together, so now let's pray. Good things will happen to you as you leave. The temple continued to be the place of sacrifice, but now you had a place that you could worship and be with your own kind and learn about who you are as a people. Uh, the most important function of worship happened in the home, though, and that's the Seder meal every year. When they would in their own home have that remembrance of what was going on with the Exodus event, that 10th plague, when they gathered around the table, girded up their loins, headed out. Is um, that important question that the youngest person in the room always has to ask? Why is this night different than any other night? And then the process of the Seder is to remind them exactly how all of this occurred.
And the temple, like the temple and tabernacle, our men couldn't go in, but the synagogue with the women still
It
go
could
in.
if they got in the higher places and didn't say a word. They couldn't interact. Where the men on the floor could ask questions and interact, the women couldn't interact. Uh, we know by culture that women were fringe, and I thought it was so horrible. The other day, I was looking at the news, and there are people over in the Middle East who the young ladies now are rebelling about against having to cover their head, and the men are up in arms over it. And the reason they are up in arms over it is because they said when they uncover their head and face, they lose value.
As property.
Right. Property value, not personal, moral, ethical value. They're not worth as much to the family to pass on. So it's kind of a sad ordeal. What happens later on is that around 333 or so, now you have the exile in 586, they come back in about 40 years or so. In 333, the Greeks become powerful and take over the entire region. And so everything in that whole Mediterranean basin becomes Greek. In fact, it became such a stronghold that Greek became the standard language, the trade language for everything. I don't know, I can remember when I was young uh, that when you went to the Olympics and they played the national anthems and they announced things, originally they did that in French because French was kind of the universal language. And then eventually they changed that to English. So no matter where it is, they announce the event in the native tongue and then they announce it in English. Uh, that was the way it was. And you talked your Aramaic in your community, but when you got ready to do business and things, you talked Greek. And in fact, this is where um, it got so worrisome about them forgetting the Aramaic language that you had them translate the Hebrew text into Greek called the Septuagint. I think I'll address that later. So they would have all their writings down in Greek so nobody could forget it. So that happened around 333. Many of these cities were taken and tried to turn into Greek communities. Uh, and then uh, this guy by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes rose up and was appointed over that Judean territory. And he wanted to turn it into an absolute Greek community. They brought in Greeks from all over to be a part of the city. Uh, and if you remember, Greeks were very proud of who they were and what they were. The Greek men would parade up and down the streets with nothing but a smile to show off their physical prowess, which was an abomination to the Jewish people. Uh, he forbade the people to worship in the Jewish way. He took over the temple, set up a statue of Zeus, and started sacrificing all kind of unclean animals, especially pigs, on the altar. Uh, and it really uh, brought destruction and harm to the people. Uh, there came a time when it was so he was trying to move outside of Jerusalem, and he started sending people, their soldiers, into other communities in order to tell them that they could no longer be Jewish. They had to worship the Roman gods. Well, they went to a little town where there was an old priest whose name was Maccabee. And when the soldiers said, you have got to stop, this old guy basically said, well, you can just stick it, which he did because he killed the soldier. And then others joined in and they defeated that little group of Greeks, which empowered them so much that they started a revolt. His son, Judas uh, Maccabee, uh, Maccabeus, began what we now term as guerrilla warfare against the Greeks, going in and trying their very best to pester and push these people out of the way so they could reclaim who they are. And in the middle of this battle, they got the most unusual ally. It was this new power coming up called Rome. And if you read in the Apocrypha, you'll find out that the Romans and the Jewish people made a pact together to support each other. And so Rome helps them drive out the Greeks. And they retake their communities, they fire back up their religion, and then that's where you hear the story of going in and they cleaned the temple up, they scrubbed everything down, they were going to bring back the right type of a sacrifice. They go into the holy place, and there's only enough oil to burn the lights in the temple for a day. And when we say the light in the temple, it's a menorah. So they had enough oil for one day to at least let that burn so they could start their faith again. And it took 8 days to purify oil to that next stage. And the lights burned 8 days so they could keep it burning. And that's the origin of the holiday Hanukkah, the festival of the lights, where they celebrate that 8 days going on. And so with Rome helping them, Israel then spent about 100 years in peace and self-government. And then around 66 or so, Rome decides they're going to take over. And they come in. But because of the treaty that they had made, they were allowed to use and worship and operate their faith community. They did not have to worship the Roman gods. That was a unique thing. And they were told, as long as you keep the peace and pay your taxes to Rome, we're going to leave you alone. And so that was part of the strong thing. And this is where we hear about Herod the Great coming in. He comes in about 43 or 44, somewhere right in there, BC, to be the head of the Jewish and Judean territories. He later is even termed King Herod. He's half Jewish, so he has an invested stake in all this. I think his mother was Jewish. Uh, his claim to fame was building. He loved to build stuff. We give him the worst rap in the world because of the killing of the children in Bethlehem. Uh, he was a really strong, powerful, and influential leader for most of his life. We don't know or remember that. One time when there was a severe famine, he actually sold his own silver and gold plates to buy food for the community. It wasn't until later in his life, when he's getting older, he gets extremely paranoid about the loss of his power. And he felt like everybody was out to get him. And that's when he started doing these things like the death of the children in Bethlehem. But one of the things he wanted to do for the people was to create a right place of worship. And being the builder that he was, he decided that he would ask permission from the Jewish people to be authorized to build a new temple. And it took a while to convince them. And the sticking point was that he could do it, but he had to do it in a way where that sacrificial worship, the sacrifices, would not be interrupted. And he guaranteed that. He would work around things to where it would get to a place where the sacrifice was never done away with. And so the work began on the temple around 19 BC. And if you remember some of the New Testament text around Jesus' time, it said it was still in the process of being built while Jesus was there. So that's how the expansion did. It is a huge, huge complex, uh, eventually expanding to 1,600 feet by 900 feet. The whole complex itself stood about 9 stories tall. The wall that was around it was 16 feet tall. And now, one of the things I want you to notice, the there you go. Down here at the bottom. Now, there's one of the sacred washing pits where you would usually, if you were out and about, you would come in and you would walk through this. You don't stop and take a bath. It's not about being so much physically clean as it is spiritually clean. You want that water to run over you to be spiritually clean. So you'd walk into that and walk out. Jesus would have gone up through these stairs in these doors, which was almost like a tunnel, and lead up into this massive courtyard. This was something new. Anybody could come into that courtyard, no matter who. It was open to everybody. This is where eventually the money changers and the sacrifice sellers set up camp. You had to have money changers because you couldn't give to the temple in dirty Roman money. So you had to exchange your Roman money for temple money to put in. Now that was the hitch with Jesus. It was not that you exchanged money, it's that they started using an unfair exchange, overcharging the way it was. And the same thing with sacrifices. If you lived far off, you would come in and you would buy a quote certified sacrifice that you could take in, and they were starting to overcharge for all of that. The Around the outside edge is a covered porch called a portico. This is where Jesus would often teach in that last week. You'd find him in that covered area for that. And then you would move in, and the center section itself is the actual temple. Way over here is the Tower of Antonia. That's Roman guards. And you see they had windows. The Roman guards could stand up on top of that thing and make sure that everybody was behaving themselves in the temple and to keep peace. Uh, Now you'll notice right around the temple complex there is a wall, and in that wall there were a number of gates. In fact, there were 10 gates that led you into the temple, and the only people who could go through those gates were Jewish people, and now women could go through that. So anybody who is Jewish could go through there. And in fact, Herod even had plaques put at each gate warning people no foreigner is to enter within the forecourt and the balustrade around the sanctuary. Whoever is caught will have himself to blame for his subsequent death. So if you're not Jewish, you don't go there because if they figure you out, you'd probably stoned. You now have a court of the women where women and children could actually go for the first time and feel like they were a part of the temple complex. This is where people who had leprosy and who were healed, they would go to that court for the priest to come out and say, "Yes, you are clean." The people who would involve themselves in a Nazarite vow. Nazarites were not lifetime. Most of the time, a Nazarite vow would last maybe a year, where you would not shave, you know, do all not drink, you isolate yourself for the purpose of trying to make yourself more holy with God. When it was time for you to step outside of that vow, this is where you went to clean up and be brought back into the community. It's also where the the collection plates, so to speak, the money towers where people could pay their temple taxes. All of that was uh, in that court. Then just inside of that was the court of the Israelites, which is where the men could go and bring their sacrifice. And then just inside of that was the court of the priest. The men couldn't go into the court of the priest. They would have to, it's almost like a line of demarcation is drawn in the sand. The priest would come up to that line and would take your sacrifice and then bring it back to you. And then, of course, then you had the core of the temple itself um, with now three main components. Uh, you had the lampstand, one table of showbread, and the altar of incense. And behind the curtain again is nothing but the foundation stone. So, during this process, one thing did change since Rome had taken over, and that was the selection of the high priest. They demanded that they were the ones to pick the high priest. It was no longer selected among the people themselves. It was basically a political office. And the Romans chose the high priest, usually out of the Sadducee group, which was a rich, influential group. And that high priest, uh, his primary job was not religious. His primary job was to take care of the community. That is, make sure they pay their taxes, make sure there's no trouble in the people. He is the bridge that stands between the Jewish people and the Romans. And if there's trouble, it's his head. Now, we could spend another 2 or 3 hours talking about how that affected Christ in his last days, but we won't go there because that's not the purpose. So now we have brought ourselves all the way up to the time of Jesus and the changing of things. So we've had the temple, the tabernacle, then we had the first temple, we had Nehemiah's temple, we have Herod's temple, and we move through all of that. So that brings us to our questions. Um, some of these we might kind of nod our head on. What is your response when you read about the temple in all of its glory, that it was built with forced labor? That's, you know, but that's the way they had to do things. Uh, what about the elaborate craftsmanship that nobody got to see? Uh, the one thing that they were able to do when the temple was destroyed was to carry their faith with them, their prayers. When you're away from the temple, from the church, what is it that ties your faith together? Does your worship community provide for you activities of learning and civic involvement? And I think that's exactly what we're studying right now on Sunday mornings, how we are involved in doing all these things for the area that God has given us to serve. The synagogue system instituted a liturgy of worship. Uh, what calls your community into the act of worship? And it's usually music. Of course, we have two at least, because Christopher Joel plays piano for a while, and you get all your good gospel side, and then he moves over to the organ, and it gets a little elevated. Even in the contemporary services, it's music that calls people together. You'd like to think that when the music starts, that we could all kind of pause and reflect and center ourselves. But we know that in reality, when the prelude starts and the music starts, it gives us permission to talk louder. And then finally, when the preacher stands up and says, okay, here we go, then it all changes. Questions or comments about any of this?
Why did it change so that the females could enter then when they couldn't before? What changed in their thought process?
It was the construction part of the temple itself. This was equivalent to standing right outside the door. And so they would allow the women and children to come in and stand outside the door. I'm not really sure where in the thought process. I'm sure there had to be some type of cooperation between the Jewish community and Herod in order to provide that. I don't know that it would be just a random thing, but it made that shift because now you had a place under Roman domination that all the Jewish people could be safe in. And that's what the court of the women really was, a safe place for everybody.
It was really a part also of gradation. I mean, the outer court was the court of the Gentiles,
Mm-hmm.
and you had the court of the women, and the court of the men, and then priests and so on.
Right.
And a bit of arrogance comes in here. If I can sit at the front in the front pew, then
Mm-hmm.
that's a distinguishing character.
Right. It is.
I think the Mormons still have a version of that where they have a temple that only people that have been purified and cleansed and wear white clothes and everything can go in, but then they also have they have what do they call them? Right, they have like a tabernacle
Right.
that they go in. And so, and I know they're not at all Jewish, but they may have gotten that from all this. Probably did.
Our niece is Mormon, and we couldn't go to her wedding because we were not Mormon.
Right.
I thought that was interesting. We could celebrate in a reception afterwards, but we were not allowed into the service.
Mm-hmm.
Culturally, going back to building the original temple, Solomon's temple, said it was forced labor. How did that process work? Was it kind of like you got assigned a task, or is it a group of people who are in servitude, or
In the actual building of it, I'm not sure how they drew straws to see who was a part of what group.
you
But
owe this much?
Right. But they were divided up for some reason. Well, and of course, if you'll read some of the histories of each individual tribe, some of the tribes had special arts and crafts gifts, and maybe that was part of it. I know that probably, they were just like when they came out and built the tabernacle, there was a group that were specially trained in the hammering out of gold. It talked about that early on, and maybe those craftsmen still were around. And so that's your task. But when you look at that territory, it's not that big of a territory. One of the things I didn't mention, which is kind of the sad thing, and we don't think about that often, but when Solomon built the temple, and you had this wonderful unified nation that we seem that it lasts for almost ever, the unified nation of Israel only lasts just over 90 years. The one block of the 12 tribes, just 90 years, which in our thinking, there's something very powerful, and there seems to be a longevity about the history of the nation, and it's very compact.
For these major labor projects, you can almost equate it to our draft.
Mm-hmm.
That each of the tribes has so many to donate at a certain time. As you say, they did have special kids.
Right.
So that was the only labor force there. And so they were assigned to take care of them.
Right. And of course, that's the way the operated already. You were allotted a particular time and sequence when you had to leave your family. They all didn't live in Jerusalem. They lived all over the place. And then they would come into Jerusalem to work their shift, so to speak, and then they'd go back home.
You said the high priest was a primarily medical physician. Was there, the specific tasks set for specific tribes? Was there any? You said Sadducees primarily would probably fulfill that role. Is there any sort of tribal affiliation as well as being?
Mm. No, really, by the time Jesus comes in that time, especially uh, after they have the revolt of the Maccabees and they reestablish it and start kind of expanding, the whole concept of the 12 tribes has disappeared. You're just uh, the the southern tribe of Judah is where we finally come up with the nickname Jew. And so when they came back and rebuilt the temple and then began their expansion, everybody was just a Jew. They were not a particular tribe.
Are there any that claim loyalty to tribes anymore, or is it just all?
I don't know. I think now most of the loyalty is whether or not you're Orthodox or or moderate. The priest that I talked about, of course, he's a little older than I am. I think he's probably right at 90 now. Uh, but he's a deeply Orthodox Jewish individual. I thought that when I was doing some of the work on this book, I actually wrote the rabbis in the Huntsville area, and I got one response, and it was from the Orthodox rabbi. Never got a response from the others. Of course, when you're talking about COVID and worship numbers and things of that nature, I guess they're a little hesitant to send somebody they never heard of information like that.